Greetings everybody, I'm sorry about the deluge of videos. This will be the third one in 3 days. That's not normally how I like to do things. It's a little bit of overload, but I am leaving for work tomorrow. I probably will not be able to upload any videos for at least a month. Or if I can upload some, it would only be very short ones from my iPhone, not the typical fare that I offer. So this is a topic that came up in the comments. It wasn't directed at me, but I saw it and thought it was a worthwhile topic. And that was a question posed that apparently there had been a large bust, multiple agencies spending millions of dollars over a long period, over a wide area, cracked down on a child slave ring and arrested many of the culprits. And although it was acknowledged that this certainly does not end child slavery or free all child slaves or anything like that, the allegation was, the taunt really, was that here the government had performed this task, this presumably a good task, and how would anarcho-capitalism address this problem? How would it reproduce this result? And presumably, the logic being, if it couldn't do this, this would either be, a reason, evidence against anarcho-capitalism, if not something that completely invalidates it. And I think it's a really interesting question, not because it brings up anything in particular, but because it's emblematic about many of the levels of discussion that have to take place whenever we're talking about not just anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism, but major reforms or abolitions of the current system. There's many implicit issues that kind of come up here. So on one level, there's the implication, and this is very, very common, that in order for anarcho-capitalism to be valid at all or not be discriminated against, it has to essentially ape the state system, that it must reproduce what the state does in a very, very specific way. So another example of this would be like schools. We could talk all day about homeschooling and private schools and whatever, neighborhood academies and online learning, Khan Academy and all this stuff, and I think most people will realize, yeah, it's going to work for most kids most of the time, and sure there'll be people who fall through the cracks, but then the objection will be, but how are you going to have a brick and mortar building in every neighborhood or every town or whatever, and how is it going to be staffed all year, and who's going to be the principal, and what are they going to do during the summer, who's going to pay for the who, and the problem with that argumentation is that it assumes that the state system must be duplicated to a more or less degree. And this is fallacious unless you assume that the state system has more or less achieved the optimal possible system. That logistically there is no other way. Maybe there is no other way, or at the very least the government is the best way that's possible. Now, if a libertarian actually would feel that way, then there'd be no reason to be a libertarian. There'd be no reason to offer reform. If you actually think that the government infrastructure is as good as is practical in human society, then there's no reason to try and change it. If someone is advocating a change, then it should be fairly obvious that they believe that there is a better way, in which case there needs to be, in terms of discussion and persuasion, some kind of attempt to do a cost-benefit analysis or a theoretical or empirical way to try and determine which way is going to be better or worse. And that is not achieved by assuming that the government has already achieved the best way, and that the question is whether or not your alternative, whether it be socialism or anarcho-capitalism, is going to recreate that system. How is another common one would be roads. How are they going to build the roads? And I think in a market-based system, roads will exist, but they will be very different. Along major thoroughfares where there is a lot of traffic between larger cities, big cities, there will be, I'm quite confident, I can't prove it, but I'm quite confident there will be toll systems. In more residential areas, these will probably be owned by HMOs or other more localized firms that basically just maintain them. They have certain free rider problems, but they're fairly minimal because not all that many people, in most circumstances, not all, are going to be, driving all over neighborhood roads. There are exceptions to this, say roads between major thoroughfares or whatever. And when neighborhoods have this happen, and this has happened where they have non-public roads, where they have private roads in neighborhoods, and they'll put up speed bumps, they'll do what it takes to reduce the free rider problem as necessary. And then you'd have competing systems of transit that are, make more market sense, which could be rail, which could be canals, could be, shipping. But what you probably wouldn't have is a systematic grid pattern of roads coating as much of the surface of the country as possible. And that's what you have in much of the United States. The states have simply elected to build grids. They can't always do it over a lake or certain rivers or whatever, but as much as possible they will build grids, regardless of where economic activity is happening, who's living where. And this is a monumental waste. If we weren't talking about anarchism but simply reforming the roads, I think it would be hard not to simply notice this and address, like, hey, why exactly are we expending these resources, first to build but then to maintain in perpetuity up to this point, these roads going everywhere. And somebody who's arguing against anarcho-capitalism to say, or whatever, again, anarcho-socialism, to say, how will your system create this exact road system? It's debatable, very debatable, that that's desirable. So implicit in this kind of argument is that. The other kind of argument is to assume that conditions would be the same. The argument being, okay, right now we have the government that is trying to stop some of this child pornography or child slavery. If the government wasn't there, then the government would not be trying to stop child slavery, ergo there would be more. This is very, very simplistic because the government's effect on any given industry is never that simple. A good example would be the drug war. People would say, oh, look at all these homicides that happen in Mexico and happen in the United States because of the drug war. And the government is, supposedly nominally attempting to thwart these, to stop the drug dealers, although apparently not very much, as it turns out. And if the government wasn't there, then wouldn't there be even more of this violence? But it's not that simple, because obviously the entire genesis of the violence in the drug war is the fact that the substances are illegal. It's an illegal market that can't be resolved through arbitration, the normal lines of arbitration, and there's a huge market, there's a lot of money to be made, and there's no civil way to kind of resolve differences. And so the fact that it's been outlawed is one of the reasons, it's probably the main reason there's so much violence involved in it. And so it's a little bit too simplistic. Look at now, if we look in the, well, I'll get more to the specifics about child slavery before in a bit here, but it's not enough to just look at one aspect of what one part of the government's doing. There's another part of this argument, and I don't know, it depends who's making the argument, but some people will go so far as to say, if you can't do this, then your system is completely invalid. If you can't eliminate child slavery, your system is invalid. I'm not saying this is the argument that was made, although it is made sometimes. It's very often that you're put, hey, if you cannot achieve this end, then your system cannot be advocated. And that is only logically correct. That's only a valid argument if the government also eliminates whatever it is you're talking about. So anarcho-capitalism cannot eliminate murder, hence anarcho-capitalism is invalid. However, the state apparently cannot eliminate murder either. In fact, in most cases, it doesn't even make an arrest. And so if anarcho-capitalism is invalid because it can't stop murder, all murders, then is not the state also invalid because it clearly cannot stop all murders? And this is probably true with pretty much any kind of negative externality we could talk about trying to curtail. There aren't any that the state completely eliminates. Now, the better kind of argument is to say, well, yes, the state can eliminate it all, but I'm going to, if it can eliminate more than the anarcho-capitalist system or whatever the alternative is, then that's a reason to support government. I think this is also fallacious because it totally ignores costs. It's not enough. Let's just say that in a free market system, there is not any attempt to stop child slavery, and that it does exist. And even though the government doesn't get rid of all of it, if it does reduce it some, and let's just assume that the net effect of government is to reduce child slavery and not to increase it, which is actually debatable. But I'll come to that in a minute. And we could say, okay, we know that on net, let's just say we could establish this. I think it would be very difficult to prove, but let's just say for the sake of argument that we could prove that on net there would be less child slavery in a government system than in an anarcho-capitalist system. That is not in and of itself nearly enough to justify government, because it totally ignores all the costs. It's not like, oh, that's just this new aspect, because in order to achieve the end of reducing child slavery, you have a state, and the state has costs. And those costs are monetary, but they're also create very large incidents of moral hazard and public choice theory, and there's this whole host of things that come with that. And you have to judge, is the reduction in the amount of child slavery worth the added costs of the government? And people can kind of react to this in a very viscerally negative way and say, oh, you're putting a dollar value on children's life. And I would say no, because the only cost of government is not dollars. The dollar cost is astronomical, and when you come right down to it, the marginal people on the edge who are paying for government, but who are not doing very well because they're necessarily poor, they suffer actually quite a great deal. But there's also the fact that many people die because of government, because perhaps they're prevented from getting treatments because there's such a thing as an FDA, because they're shot by cops, because they're killed in wars. And unless you're going to take that into account, there's no reason or basis for concluding, at least necessarily, that a simple reduction in X, means that the government's justified. That reduction in X has to be worth the cost of having the government in the first place. Nor is it really valid to calculate your costs based on a hypothetical or idealized government, to say, oh, yes, there's abuse now, yes, there's costs now. I'm a liberal, I don't believe in war. In the hypothetical government that I'm justifying here, that I'm arguing in favor of, I'm arguing against your anarcho-capitalist alternative. But I'm not defending our current government. I'm defending the Noam Chomsky friendly, Howard Dean, Obama rhetorical government that doesn't exist, but that I would like. That is really, really problematic. You're assuming an idealized, you're assuming a government that is going to match your personal ideas. And this is kind of a side issue. I've talked about this before, but people tend to, unless they accept that everything in the government is fine and dandy, which very few people are willing to do, they end up defending something other than what they have in their mind. They're talking about, I really like a government that has these characteristics, and it's not even applicable to the government that we have, but de facto they're defending the government that we have. So if you want to come out and say, well, I'm really a constitutionalist and I want a government that's 100 times smaller than the one we have today, and it doesn't abuse its power, making statements like that you need a very high burden of proof, a very good argumentation to prove to me how it's not going to be corrupt, or the corruption is going to be at a significantly low ebb, or how are you going to eliminate problems like the incentive problem? How are you going to make it so politicians and bureaucrats do not abuse their power, or that they can't, or if they do abuse it, that abuse will be at such a low ebb as to factor into calculations? Or there's also the tried and true information problem. How are they going to know what's best? Because they have, one of the characteristics that people insist states have is a divorce from the market, that they not be based on profit and loss and prices and production and subjective value and the arbitrage of the market. So okay, that's fine that it's not fine, but you have this institution that has those characteristics. You need to explain how the cost of having that type of institution is not greater than whatever benefits you're trying to derive from. And I think that's just an extremely simplistic. I mean, these costs, when people try and make cost benefit analyses, you know, the typical way they do it is to simply ignore all costs of government. You know, and or if they do look at it, well, they go, oh well, it's only such and such a tax burden. Hardly. That doesn't even begin to talk about the ways in which government alters society, and that those, to the extent that they alter people's preferences and how they act, are cost. And that's to everyone all the time. And yeah, not to mention the fact that there's blood on their hands. So I think arguing about in favor of your hypothetical state or your idealized state is unwarranted. I think as it stands right now, we just have to pragmatically and intellectually honestly accept the states that we have and say that's this. When you argue for the state, then you are arguing for the U.S. government of today, not the U.S. government of 1800, not the Norwegian government, not you know, the construct that John Rawls would have preferred, or whoever else, or John Locke or Karl Marx. We're talking about this government, and if you're going to amend this government, it has to be an amendment that is plausible. So you might say, well, if we just change one or two little policies here, that would make the difference. And if those are policies that likely could be changed, you have an argument. If you're talking about, well, there just won't be corruption, I'm sorry, I'm still waiting for the argument that says that's not going to happen. Or everyone in my government's going to be altruistic. I'm sorry, you're going to have a pretty high burden of proof to assert that that's going to happen. And the minor tweakings that are more plausible are less likely to have much effect on the overall cost. So there's that element also. Now, and then of course there is another problem here. I guess I would call it the Humerian problem. There's a moral, ethical kind of objection. Let's say, okay, child, and this is not going to be my main line of argument, but I'm just going to put it out there because it is a plausible way to kind of go about talking about this. Yes, child slavery is wrong, but that doesn't mean that it is right or justified or moral to establish a state to prevent it. You can't go around and tell people that they have to donate to your anti-child slavery campaign. Like I can, I was going to use a gun as a prop, but I could go around with my guns. I could get all the free staters in my house, and I say, you know what, child slavery is a big problem. Or better yet, I just saw that there's apparently a lice outbreak at the public schools in the town I live in, Manchester, New Hampshire. A lice outbreak that the school board has decided not to alert people to because it would cause finger pointing. Basically, they don't want to be blamed for it, and so they're just not going to talk about it. And lice, it sucks. It's not, we don't have a big typhus outbreak, thankfully, but let's say, but it's not good. It's bad. And so let's say, me and my libertarian friends here, we loaded up all of the weapons that we own, that we have, and started banging on the doors on our street and started saying, listen, we want you to donate, we'll decide how much, to help us free the children from the grips of the lice-infected public schools. Nobody would say that's justified. Not libertarians, not statists, not anybody. And if we said the reason we were doing it is to prevent child slavery, it doesn't matter if we're sincerely attempting to do that. It doesn't matter if we actually have some kind of institutional framework through which to try and attempt to do that. It's not considered legitimate by anybody. And that there's no logical reason why this isn't true for the government. If you're going to say that that there should be a monopoly on the government anyway. If you're going to argue that it is moral to force people to help save the children, and that's very debatable, but let's assume that that is a justifiable position, that we're actually allowed to do that. There's no monopoly of having the right to do it implied in that argument. So again, anybody could go around using guns to raise money to save the enslaved children, which would be kind of ironic. I mean, if you're forcing people to pay for something you want to do, that's not that different from slavery actually. But it's unclear where the government monopoly to do this comes from. That's not the main way I want to look at it, though, because if we look particularly at the issue of child slavery, I think there's very good reasons to assume, and to argue at least, that government involvement increases the demand for child slavery. One way that they do this that's obvious is the prohibition on prostitution. Men want sex, women want sex. I think they have different kinds of emphases in what they want and when they want it or whatever, but they do. And one obvious way to alleviate this is to have somebody give them sex, and if they're not interested in them in a relationship, to be compensated by money, if they agree. Of course, obviously, if somebody does not agree, that's a different matter entirely. And it's very hard ethically for most people, I think, to argue against this. There's some people who have a visceral emotional reaction that it's bad for someone to voluntarily engage in a sex act. Although this is something that even many feminists have come to realize is not the case. By prohibiting this, and now they can't stop it all the way, prostitution most certainly still does exist, but it's in a much lower ebb than it would be otherwise. That demand, that sexual hunger, is still going to be there. Now, this is not a justification for anybody for for the actions that someone might take to sate that demand. It's a fact that people have a demand for food. That doesn't justify homicide to obtain it. However, if we were to ban retail providers of food, we should hardly be surprised if people started taking more extreme measures to get their food. Likewise, if we are going to ban prostitution, we should not be surprised that there's now a demand for that other. Now, it's not just this. There's restrictions on pornography. There's restrictions on age of consent laws. That is a whole other topic, but unless you have the position that the age of consent laws now are ideal, that they cannot be improved upon, that the legal definition of who and who cannot consent has pretty much been established beyond any reasonable doubt, then you have to concede that it's possible that there might be some people who could alleviate voluntarily and morally some of the demand for sex slavery, for sexual acts from younger people, in a way that is currently completely banned. So there's that. And also, I think I already mentioned pornography. That's the other one. Now, I think these taken together lead, and there's other reasons, basically relating to poverty. If you are poor, or you're powerless, or whatever else, there's probably a higher chance that you're going to have to revert to these methods to obtain sexual gratification than if you're well off. Likewise, if you're well off, or relatively speaking more well off, you're less susceptible to falling victim to these crimes. A wealthy family is likely able to protect their children from becoming sex slaves, either directly or indirectly. And in the event that they became sex slaves, they would likely have means at their disposal to attempt to rectify this. If you are poor, this is less the case. And the question then becomes, would there be more or less poor people in a free market economy? Now, since government is not free, since it requires the extraction and reallocation of resources from society, and that this extraction is monumentally gigantic, and that the way that it is dispersed is anything but egalitarian. The lion's share of its expenditures go to wealthy individuals, and that the lion's share, not lion's share, but a proportionally high amount of the taxation and cost falls on poorer people who are less able to evade the restrictions of government. I think it is very plausible that there would be less disparity in wealth, although there'd still be a disparity. I'm not going to say everyone would be egalitarian, and I'm not saying egalitarianism is the norm. I'm just thinking when you have one city that's expropriating whatever it is, $4 trillion a year, $1 trillion a month, or whatever it is, from the rest of the continent, and spending it disproportionately there, you're going to get people who are, you're going to have, what's the word, more of a chopstick and less of a pyramid in terms of wealth distribution. So there's that. there's also the likelihood that there would simply be a higher mean level, that there would be less difference, although there'd still be differences, and everybody would be somewhat richer probably. Now, are we going to find the one or two people who this is not the case? True. And that actually, though, this has, if I'm right, and I don't think it's that outlandish to say that I am, it's at least debatable. So, that as the number of people who are truly poor shrinks, a number of dollars available in charity to take care of those people goes further, and we kind of have a feedback loop, which is not going to ever reduce poverty to zero, but it's going to make it a problem that becomes less severe as time goes by, and that would be much reduced relative to current times. In that case, what we have as a scenario is there are fewer people susceptible to sex slavery, more people who don't need it, who can get other alternatives that are not going to be sex slavery, and I think that it is reasonable to argue that there would actually be less. Would there be none? No. Is there none in the state? No, that's not true either, so that's not a fair comparison. But then I would be remiss if I did not mention that part of the cost of government, as we have it in the United States, is killing children. And this is where my subjective valuations and preferences will leak into my argument from a theoretical, from a strictly theoretical point of view. Because the U.S. federal government kills children by the thousands, or even the millions if you go long enough over time. The U.S. government is perfectly happy launching sanctions and embargoes that do not harm our political enemies but kill children by the hundreds of thousands or millions. In Iraq, in the 90s, the number they point out is 1 million, and Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State for the government, admitted this number. She didn't dispute it, say, oh no, it's only 10,000 or whatever. She admitted this number. I was watching a debate about chemtrails the other day, and someone pointed out, there's no debate that the government is evil. They'll drop nuclear bombs on children. And that sounds like hyperbole, except it's not. It's a historical fact that everyone's familiar with. Now, people debate its efficacy, but you can't debate that it happened. They dropped nuclear bombs on children, and that doesn't... that kind of diminishes the fact that they were dropping regular bombs on children for years on a much greater scale in total even than the nuclear blasts. Now that's kind of old, but they're still today using drones, dropping bombs, and killing children. Like killing children by the hundreds, maybe even the thousands every year. But that's only the foreign children. Apparently, they don't matter in the calculus. And kind of the retort here I was going to say somehow this is all justifiable, that the government can kill innocent children. The government admits that these children are innocent, and not just children, but other people as well, in most cases. And just that their random hunt to destroy Al-Qaeda, which apparently has completely failed since it's taking over the Sunni triangle of Iraq as we speak, or at least attempting to, in a way that's far more dramatic and powerful than the Al-Qaeda that existed before the government started killing children, is, I don't know, apparently not something up for debate. We look at children in the United States. There is child rape and child abuse that happens in the public schools. There's an entire room in New York City dedicated to teachers who have been caught doing this and who can't be fired. Look at the incentives of that. You can actually commit child abuse in your job and not get fired if you work for the government. But talk about incentivizing child abuse. Those children apparently don't count. They are not to be measured in the balance of ideas between the efficacy of states and non-states. Are there huge numbers of children being sexually abused in school? I don't know. It's not something that gets regularly studied for some reason. The police abuse children, both sexually, physically, beating them up. Just today, police says he smells marijuana, tackles a kid, breaks his face, and they kill them too. They shoot them in no-knock raids and all kinds of other attacks. And if you want to say that well, I can imagine a scenario where this is justified. Well, maybe sometimes it is, but it's pretty absurd to assume that it always is. And it's pretty absurd to argue that the war on drugs is justified or that its cost justifies, whatever socially beneficial utopian ideas you had in the first place for instituting it. How many little black girls need to get killed in their beds because, their door got battered down, and they may not have had any drugs in the house, or maybe they find a single pipe or a few ounces, or even if they found crack cocaine, it wouldn't even be justified. None of those children seem to matter at all. How about not as dramatic, but on net, probably no worse, or a little better, the fact that millions and millions of children are compulsorily forced to enter institutions that are extremely inefficient and questionable in their ability to provide any kind of net benefit. These are public schools, obviously. It would be wrong to allege that they're all being sexually abused, but it would not be wrong to allege that they are being forced to spend up to 12 years in an institution that does them very, very little good. Most of that time is wasted. It's extremely expensive, and there's very little to show for the kids afterwards. Again, this is not really something that can, you could construct your hypothetical government again and pretend that public schools are raising everybody out of poverty and that they're providing education to all these millions of children who would otherwise have none, and blah, 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 blah. And you are definitely not talking about the public schools as they exist in this country. Because as they exist in this country, the children who have, bad family homes, the poor children who are the excuse for every kind of government brutality, they are not helped by public schools. They attend them, usually, mostly, sometimes they drop out, sometimes not. They'll get degrees, and they'll end up being impoverished anyway. They'll end up on welfare, they'll end up on bad jobs. The very few children in that situation who do well are motivated and exceptional in such a way that it's hard to imagine how they could not fail. And for the large number of children who can read and write and function well and get good jobs, and they do go to public schools, correlation is not equal causation. There's every reason to suspect that the reason they do well is because of the stable, familiar environment that they're in, the socioeconomic status of their parents. And this is a fact that's well understood and admitted to even within the institutions that teach teachers to be teachers. And so it's a largely extremely expensive institution that's largely irrelevant and also detrimental. And the fact that we're talking about tens of millions of kids whose childhood, the most important part of their development, is handicapped in this ridiculously absurd way. We don't have to say that's child abuse, but to say that that's not a cost is also very disingenuous. It's an enormous cost, not just on those individual kids, but everybody who is denied the full vigor of their human potential as a member of society as a result of their immersion in what is really a ridiculous system. Let's see. Yeah, we already talked the murders, and then this is the one that's probably the most visceral, if not necessarily the most vital, is, look at the children of the Branch Davidians. I know this was 20 years ago at this point. Actually 21 years ago. Why do those children not count? Why is it okay for the ATF and the FBI to murder them and then actually take pictures posing over their charred remains? Those children, the way that they died, the government pumped a type of tear gas that's not supposed to be used indoors for, 8 hours, something like that, inside, to the point where anybody subjected to it would cease to be a coherent, functioning being. And then the building caught on fire. Now, the government claims the Branch Davidians started it. There's zero evidence of this. The government was shooting ferret rounds, incendiary rounds, and just regular rounds of ammunition in there. It would be dramatically unlikely that if they didn't accidentally cause it at the very least, and that's assuming they didn't cause it on purpose, which maybe they didn't. It burns. The particulate matter of this tear gas, when it settles, when it burns, creates cyanide gas, which caused the people who inhaled it to have muscle contractions that broke their own backs. You know, like their head would peel back and touch their tailbone, and they'd die. And then they would their remains would be charred. And after the smoke clears, and all of them are dead except for the couple who managed to be in the sight of the media and escape murder. Then the government that we're supposed to laud so much, they're glorious agents in their task forces, you know, with all of their pensions and money and equipment that the rest of us are forced to pay, come and take safari pictures over their little corpses. And nothing that the Branch Davidians did warranted this. You could say David Koresh committed statutory rape. That doesn't mean you murdered the children. The children were innocent of anything other than being the children of parents who were maybe a little weird. And yet, this doesn't even matter at all. Now, again, this is a dramatic, visceral example that's not necessarily the most telling. But where is the outrage? Why is that okay? Why is the... It's funny. The state can have as much blood dripping off of its hands as possible, and that does not count. That does not matter. But then another system, anarcho-capitalism, that doesn't explicitly cause or create or actually kill someone, but maybe fails to prevent a crime, well, that is simply barbaric. I go on, as mentioned, you know, the U.S. government spends a lot of money supporting dictators around the world, and some of these people do have child sex slavery. And one that's actually fairly well known, I remember watching Frontline did a good documentary on it, in Afghanistan are the warlords that we support, you know, the government there, and they are the government there, you know, so in abstract this is an example of the government doing this. They have what's known as bachsbazi. These are basically young little boys who they dance. It's nominally about dancing, but it's actually about being a sex slave to powerful men. And these guys are on the dole of the CIA and the U.S. government, the State Department. So, blah, 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 I hate child slavery, blah, 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 anarcho-capitalism won't stop slavery. Oh, I don't care if the U.S. government is taxing us, sending the money over to people who actually have child slaves and rape them. And then murder them if their wives start, you know, pestering them about the fact that they're fucking little boys instead of them. That, you know, the fact that the way it's outlined, the belief in government is the cost-benefit, the equation that you know you do the cost-benefit analysis is completely biased to the point where you automatically will assume government automatically wins, because anything it does that's negative, you either assert you just don't count it, or you just assert it's not negative. Anything the government does is inherently moral. You know, if they do it, it is justified. So all these examples that you bring up, none of them matter at all, because everything the government does is 100% justified. And so these aren't horrible murders of children, these drone strikes, public schools, blah, blah, down the list, you know, no-knock raids, drug war. I didn't even talk about HUD and welfare and you know, these urban slums that the government operates that ruins the lives of children. Many of them die. I mean, you know, people get murdered in the slums all the time. If anarcho-capitalism is wrong because sex slavery could exist, and it probably would in some very small way. Why is government allowed to exist when it has, you know, thousands of murders happening, especially in places where it has the most central control? You know, the thousands of murders aren't happening, you know, up in northern New Hampshire where there aren't that many government agents, or, you know, in western Nebraska or in Idaho or whatever. It's happening in the inner cities where government has the most layers of control, the most direct bureaucratic influence. Which is not to attribute causation, but is simply to show that they're apparently not very good at preventing the crimes that supposedly invalidate other systems like anarcho-capitalism. And again, unless you're going to just premise everything and just say it doesn't matter, anything the government does is fine, anything the government fails to do is not the government's fault. That's another thing. It's not the government's fault that doesn't happen. It's libertarians' fault. Not everyone will assert that, but it's just kind of absurd where you have this... Basically, the argument can be constructed in such a way that government is automatically correct all the time, and any questions to the contrary are to be dismissed. And it's really quite sickening. There aren't that many people who explicitly assume that whatever the government does is moral. There are a lot of people who like to kid themselves that that's what's happening. That they have this idealized version of the social contract and the will of the people and the public servants, and that yes, maybe some stuff happens here and there on the side, but there's no systemic problems. And I think that that's just completely ridiculous, and that uh, the government is it's not targeting children. I don't believe that's hardly the point. The burden of its cost, the plunder that it requires to function, and the alterations that it causes to society are most harmful to the people who are least able to defend themselves. And this syllogistically basically means children, among other groups. And so again, I don't think it's a plot on their part to kill or destroy children. It's just what happens. And I think it's not that. I think it's, well, to me, it's very clear that an anarcho-capitalist system based on private property and whatever would have much less of this. However, if you don't agree, at the very least, it's debatable. And to assume that there would just be more, and that it couldn't be, and I guess I should address this too, like to actually directly answer the question, in an anarcho-capitalist system, assuming things like parents love their children and families love their children, there is a market incentive to keep children safe. The things that families could do individually to prevent their children from being kidnapped are pretty significant. Not enough to prevent it from ever happening to everybody, but enough to make not that many people vulnerable to it. Since it is something that there's an incentive to, there would be firms that could make a lot of money attempting to keep children safe, and they could employ private detectives and security guards and whatever else to try and hunt down. They could probably have fake guys who go around pretending to be pimps to try and catch these, or trying to be Johns, or whatever you call someone who tries to hire a child sex slave, to locate these people and get, when they wouldn't be bound by all these rules that the government agents use as kind of a cover for them to not do their job, is what essentially it amounts to. And would it be 100% effective? No, that's not the case with government either. Now, the way this people kind of say, well, yeah, for people who have money and for families who love their kids, then yes, it probably wouldn't be that big of a problem. But what about the really poor kids? What about the kids whose their family doesn't care if they become a sex slave, or even decides to sell them into sex slavery, or just too stupid or too inept, or too poor to do anything about it? Well, you know what? You've created a scenario, and I don't care what society you live in, that kid is in deep shit one way or another. And there's no guarantee that that kid in this society isn't going to be horribly harmed, or maybe end up in sex slavery now, with the government lording over him anyway. So, yeah, we can make this scary, hypothetical scenario, but your system, unless your system can deadshot deal with it even better, it's not exactly a very persuasive example, hypothetical scenario, and that's what I think is going on here also. So, anyway, it's been a pleasure. It's been the last couple days, and I will talk to you all later, and winter is coming.